I was 22 when I was raped.
I was 19. I was 20.
I didn't report it for, 1,000 reasons, a million reasons.
It was somebody I was involved with.
It was a friend of a friend.
My drug dealer.
Met this photographer by myself.
I got very drunk. I met some guy in this bar.
He started trying to kiss me and I said no.
He takes my left leg and raises it on his shoulder.
He went to put his hand in my panties and I tried to kind of deflect his hand, and that's when he slapped my hand away.
I blacked out.
I was fighting pretty hard at this point, just saying no, please don't, please don't.
I came to.
Internally, I was shaking. I was really trying to look as calm as possible.
And I could tell that something that I hadn't wanted to happen happened.
He held me down and he forced himself inside me.
I was being pleasant and nice just so I could remain safe and get out of there.
And I kind of just ran out into the street with my pants on inside out and my shoes off.
And he sat up and he looked at me, and that was, I guess, the scariest moment for me, because I could tell he was deciding whether he was actually going to stop or not, and that was the moment that I realized that I had thought I was in control of a situation that I was not in control of at all.
And I blame myself for putting myself in that situation.
I knew that I had no proof.
I could hear people's judgment saying, well, why did you do that? It was your fault.
I was still in physical pain from this and sitting there going, oh, well, no one's gonna believe me.
It was my word against his.
Everyone was just gonna go, this girl just, slept with this guy and changed her mind.
I wasn't the perfect victim.
I figured, who's gonna believe some cokehead college girl?
I didn't try to fight him off, or I didn't slap him around, or, I didn't pick up the phone and call 911.
I didn't know that I was important enough to draw boundaries around what people could and couldn't do with my body. Who wants to come forward with the literal most violating thing that can happen to you, relive it, and then have people telling you that you're making it up?
And I thought I would just be better off trying to put this behind me.
I couldn't imagine pressing charges and then having to sit in a courtroom and look at his face over and over.
I thought, well, that's giving him what he wants. I'm spending more time on him, or spending more energy on this.
I imagine, and I think rightfully so, that it would have been more traumatizing for me in many ways had I reported it. It's up to a survivor to decide what they do with their story. It's up to them if they want to report it or not.
I don't want this to be a part of who I am.
I hated myself a lot at the time.
We are violated, we are harassed, we are touched, we are trapped, we're scared. And we just take a chip on the shoulder and we keep our lives going, and that's not fair to us.
And I think it would be wrong to tell them that they don't get to decide what happens next.
Welcome to our presentation for Interpersonal Violence, Ending the Silence for Nursing 2512. Our group consists of Hannah, Anna, Floriana, Burton, and myself, Joel. While culturally condemned, violence is often glorified in films, TV, books, and music. Many movies and TV shows aren't afraid to portray violence, which brings up a separate debate about why it's more appropriate to show violence over such things as sex or nudity in media. This violence can have a desensitizing effect, and recent studies have confirmed the desensitization to both violence and sex in movies. That can be found in Romer et al. In 2014. Furthermore, it was concluded that exposure to such things as violent video games increases the risk of desensitization to violence, which in turn may increase aggression and decrease pro-social behavior. It was a study by Brockmeyer in 2015. And acts of violence rarely occur without other forms of violation, such as violations of human rights and discrimination. Violation of another person may result not only in physical harm, but also in emotional trauma, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, social abuse, and physical neglect. Therefore, harmful abuse can be perpetrated without any physical violence. A good example is overt versus covert aggression. Overt aggression focuses more on the physical or directly lashing out at a target, while covert aggression can be such things as gossiping, spreading false rumors, or the act of ostracizing. It was commonly thought girls are more covert, with boys showing more overt aggressive tendencies, but studies have found it's more complicated than that, such as studies by Coy et al. In 1999 and Betancourt and Miller in 1996. Interpersonal violence can occur within relationships as well as from strangers and acquaintances. This includes violence against children, women, and elders, abuse of spouses or partners, violence within the context of dating, which is commonly referred to as intimate partner violence, violence witnessed by children, and the abuse and neglect of frail and vulnerable persons. Violence is considered to be deeply gendered. Men are more likely to be injured by strangers in public, while women are in greater danger of violence from intimate partners in their own homes. Women are also at greater risk of sexual violence. According to Tittle and Paternoster in 2000, gender is the strongest and most consistent correlate of crime and delinquency, with males more likely to offend than females. Also, Vold and colleagues from 2002 claim that there are various theories as to why women's crime rates are so low and men's are so high. While it's recognized that men may also be victims of intimate partner abuse, the incidence, nature, and impact of that abuse is more severe for women. So we've chosen to focus on this type of interpersonal violence, specifically violence against women, as the focus of our presentation. Moving on to historical perspectives on violence and abuse. In 1962, Kemp coined the term battered child syndrome. This term is used to characterize a clinical condition in children who have experienced serious physical abuse, most likely from a parent or parent figure, and is a serious cause of disability and even death. That came from 1985. In 1977, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect is formed. And in Canada, child abuse and exploitation are prohibited by the Criminal Code. In 1993, researchers Humphreys and Ramsey considered the interaction of several factors that focused attention and helped raise concern for child abuse. These factors included violence in Southeast Asia, the women's movement, and interest demonstrated by social scientists. The abuse of female partners has deep historical roots. The WHO's World Report on Violence and Health and a subsequent multi-country study on women's health found that rates of violence against women vary considerably among different cultures and describes violence against women as both a manifestation and a cause of gender inequity. In an older cross-cultural study focusing on both gender and culture from 1995, Archer and McDaniel found that women from Australia and New Zealand were found to use more violent solutions to conflict than did men from Sweden and Korea. Risk factors for violence against women include economic inequality between genders, levels of female mobility and autonomy, attitudes towards gender roles and violence against women, involvement of extended family, neighbors, and friends in domestic violence incidents, levels of male-male aggression and crime, and some measure of social capital. Prevalence of elder abuse began to be recognized in the late 1970s. At this time, the Manitoba Association on Gerontology developed guidelines to identify elder abuse and protocols for practice. Elizabeth Podnieks provided early leadership in the study of elder abuse. Her national survey on abuse of the elderly in Canada in 1993 sought to identify for the first time in Canada the prevalence and abuse of the elderly. It included material abuse, chronic verbal aggression, physical violence, and neglect. Moving on to an intersectional perspective. Violence and abuse are seen from a perspective that moves beyond a gender-only analysis. It considers how class, racialization, colonization, heterosexism, homophobia, and other forms of inequity shape the extent and impact of violence. According to Hankvisky and Verco, an intersectional perspective shifts to social explanations of violence, shifts away from assigning blame and responsibility to victims, structural inequalities causing and perpetuating violence, and the importance of social policy in reducing and ending violence.
So we're going to talk about some theoretical perspectives on how we can see violence through different lenses. So we can look at violence through inter-individual models, psychosocial models, sociological models, as well as feminist perspectives. So the first one being inter-individual models, the focus is really on the offender's characteristics as the chief determinants of violence, as well as the characteristics of the victims. So it links to personality disorders such as alcohol or substance abuse, mental illness, and character disorders. So we're looking at traits within individuals that can perpetuate violence. And reports also show that there's a bias against women by victim blaming, as shown by Ian S. et al. In 1991. And this has the action to ultimately excuse men for their abusive behaviors. So the next construct we can take a look at are social psychological models. So we're looking at social learning theory by Bandura in 1969 that suggests that growing up in violent homes predisposes children towards violent behavior by means of conditioning. And this also makes it possible for an intergenerational transmission of violence to occur. Finally, we have sociological models. Violence and abuse may occur in environments that tolerate violent actions, and this can be determined by socioeconomic constructs such as housing, poverty, social supports, and others in the community. And with this type of view, we're looking at bigger constructs, the larger picture, mainly broad factors that relate to social determinants of health, well-being, and also how they relate to violence. And kind of to tie all these points together, we can consider the ecological theory as proposed by Garbarino in 1977. So we can really see that violence cannot be limited to just the microsystem of the individuals that are involved. It really is related to the macrosystem, such as societal constructs, social services, neighbors, local politics, mass media, things like that. We can't look at violence through one type of lens. We also need to look at the broad constructs that may support violence as a whole. Finally, we have feminist perspectives. So economic and social processes operate directly and indirectly to support a patriarchal social or family order. This leads to the subordination of women and influences the historical pattern of systematic violence directed against women. The feminist perspective also knows that violence is not strictly gender-based, but is existent in all forms of society, including in race, culture, disability, social class, age, and sexual orientation. So we're really talking about power differences between gender classes, sexism, heteronormativity, albiism, which is the discrimination of those that are disabled, as well as ageism.
Okay, so next we're going to go into why is this an issue? And the first one I'm going to focus on is high prevalence. So the most recent data from 2014 shows that more than 320,000 Canadians were victims of a violent crime. 26% of these were victimized by a family member. 70% of victims were women and girls. More than 15,000 victims of a violent crime were under 12 years old and were most often harmed by a family member. More than 9,000 seniors were victims of a violent crime, about 1/3 of these committed by a family member. And on top of all of these stats, about 70% of spousal violence is not reported to the police. Second, the effects on women. So women who are victims of interpersonal violence can experience a host of health problems. Women can suffer from the direct effects of physical injuries, such as bruises and broken bones, chronic physical health problems, such as chronic pain, frequent headaches, migraines, visual problems, STIs, gynecological problems, hypertension, infections such as the flu, peptic ulcer disease, irritable bowel disease, and unplanned pregnancies. Along with unplanned pregnancies, we also know that pregnant women are at a higher risk to be abused, and those pregnant women that are abused are at a particularly high risk for a preterm delivery and a low birth weight baby. And women can also suffer from mental health problems, including clinical depression, chronic or acute symptoms of anxiety, serious sleep disturbances, symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress syndrome, substance abuse and dependence, and thoughts of suicide. The third one is the effect on children. So children who live in a home where mothers are abused and where violence between parents occurs experience signs and symptoms of PTSD. This can manifest itself as behavioral problems such as truancy, disturbed sleep patterns, decreased school performance, lack of positive peer relationships, increased worry for their mothers, and fear. Children who are exposed to violence and abuse learn that violence is the way to settle their problems and achieve their own ends. Children who experience maltreatment and abuse can suffer from long-term emotional and academic problems, such as difficulty concentrating, little control over their anger, and may suffer from eating disorders and are at a higher risk of dropping out of school. The next two focus on a cost to the women and a cost to the Canadian society. And these two can really be combined, and I'm just going to focus in on this image here. So the most recent Justice Canada study by Zhang et al. Estimated that the cost of one type of intimate partner violence, specifically spousal violence, on Canadian society at $7.4 billion in 2009. This number includes a variety of factors, such as justice system costs, legal aid, and costs to the civil justice system, the cost of divorce, moving expenses or funerals, the cost to healthcare, and many other factors as well. So when considering who pays for spousal violence, we need to consider three parties: the government, the individuals, and the private sector. Here you can see intangible costs in the left hand corner. And intangible costs include emotional costs to the victims and the family, things like pain and suffering, and loss of life. They're called intangible because they don't have a market value. So in order to get a dollar value for something like pain and suffering, in this study, surveys like the Quality of Life Adjusted Years, QALYs, were looked at, which essentially add up the years of life lost due to premature death caused by disease or injury, and the years of healthy life lost due to a disease or injury. There's also intangible costs make up over 74.1% of the total economic impact of spousal violence, or $5.5 billion. Tangible costs include loss of goods and services that have a price on the market. Of the $1.7 billion of tangible costs, 63.8%, or $1.1 billion, was paid by the government for cost items like the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, and the healthcare system. Approximately 30%, or $0.5 billion, was borne by the victims through cost items including lost wages, lost education, damaged or stolen property, and moving expenses. Within this dollar amount, abused women suffer losses up to $7 million annually in wages and productivity. The remaining 7% of tangible costs, or about $0.1 billion, was borne by the private sector through loss of output, loss of productivity due to tardiness and distraction, and associated administration costs. So what issues should nurses be informed of, and what information should we incorporate into our nursing practice? So the first one, the use of gender-neutral language. The use of gender-neutral language in discussing all types of interpersonal violence erroneously creates the impression that violence and abuse are committed equally by men and women in society. The second one, language that labels. Language that labels, such as battered women, reduces the person to the experience of violence. So it is important to use language that acknowledges the person, not just the problem. Example, women who have been battered. The third one, myths. So a lack of understanding about the extensiveness in violence and myths associated with violence. The first myth is that it is mainly people living in poverty who act violently towards each other. Healthcare providers, in this sense, do not consider that professionals and people from an upper socioeconomic bracket could be victims or perpetrators of violence within their families. Poor people become stereotyped as violent, while others in a higher socioeconomic status would receive little intervention, as we would believe that violence could not possibly be happening in that home. And the second myth is that people from certain racialized groups are inherently more violent. It is critical for nurses to recognize that it is mistaken to use population statistics, such as higher rates of violence experienced by Aboriginal women, to predict individual behaviors, such as anticipating violence when caring for a particular Aboriginal person.
I found a study by Beccaria et al. In 2003 that further explored these myths in nursing students from all levels of an undergraduate program in an Australian regional university. The students participated in focus groups and subsequent surveys that explored their perceptions, attitudes, and knowledge of interpersonal violence. The results showed that the students had limited and stereotypical beliefs regarding what constitutes interpersonal violence and who perpetrates it, and they also indicated that they felt underprepared to deal with interpersonal violence situations in clinical practice. Some other things to keep in mind as well are the persistent underreporting of child abuse cases, the need for prevention and recognition of abuse in elders who live in their home or in the homes of family members, and the ongoing lack of reporting of violence against nurses in the workplace.
So we're going to mention a few points about research now. The most comprehensive national study of violence against women was the 1993 Violence Against Women study. 29% of women had at least one episode of violence. 2/3 of these reported happening more than once. Since the VAWS, items have been added to the General Social Survey. It does not employ safeguards as with the VAWS. The GSS found 7% of women in common law or married relationships reported physical or sexual assault by a spousal partner at least once in the last 5 years, versus 8% in 1999, and a decline from 12% in the VAWS. Now we're going to take a look at violence in the Aboriginal communities. In the Aboriginal communities, violence is involved in a context of historical and ongoing colonization, racialization, and ongoing discrimination, including healthcare experiences. 24% of Aboriginal women experienced spousal abuse in the 5 years preceding the 2004 GSS, compared to 7% of women in the general population. Aboriginal women were 8 times more likely to experience more severe violence than non-Aboriginals to be killed by their partners. Aboriginal children are more likely to be investigated for maltreatment. Investigations are more likely to be substantiated, more likely to be kept open for ongoing services, and more likely to result in children being placed in out-of-home care. 64% of respondents had experienced violence and abuse, with 76% aware family members had been abused in one study. Sexual abuse against Aboriginal children is quite prevalent. 25% to 50% of Aboriginal women were victims of sexual abuse as children, compared to 20 to 25% within the non-Aboriginal population. The trauma theory explains the victimization of Aboriginal peoples, where victimization of Aboriginal people as individuals and as a society, and it's attributed to the colonization process that disrupted families, culture, and communities. Now we're going to mention a few points about dating violence. In a survey of college and university students, 45% of women had been sexually assaulted while in a relationship. However, prevalence varies by study. The 1993 VAWS suggested that 16% of women experienced physical or sexual violence in a dating relationship since the age of 16, where 20 to 30% had experienced physical or sexual coercion. We're going to take a look at workplace violence now. In BC and Alberta, 46% of those surveyed experienced one or more types of violence in the last 5 shifts working, including emotional abuse, threat of assault, physical assault, verbal sexual harassment, and sexual assault. The Canadian Public Health Association concluded up to 70% of nurses have been abused or threatened on the job. There is a lack of reporting and a tolerance of abuse against nurses. Duncan et al. Reported 70% of those who had experienced violence indicated they had not reported it. Now we're going to mention some points about violence against the elderly. Abuse and neglect of older Canadians is explained as violence continuing into older adulthood, arising as persons become more vulnerable with age, and it's important to note that it's still gendered, so women are at higher risk than males. 4% of the elderly reported financial, material, and verbal abuse by family members and other people. 10 years later, 7% of older adults in the GSS reported experiencing emotional abuse, which included name-calling, being put down, isolated, or being taken advantage of financially by caregivers or children. Older Canadians are 67% more likely to be abused by strangers or acquaintances than by family members. However, 1/3 of violent crimes reported to police involved elderly abuse by family members. We're going to talk a little bit about violence against children now. Violence against children includes physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect of children. There are no central data sets collected for violence against children as there are for adults. Most data is from child welfare caseloads, police files on assault and homicide, and hospitalizations for violence-related injuries. Child abuse often overlaps with violence against women. It's estimated that 70% of children that are abused are from families where women are abused. In this figure, you can see the child and youth victims between 0 and 17 years of age of police-reported sexual offenses by province and territory. You can notice that there is a marked difference between the territories and the provinces. It's estimated as many as 90% of cases are not reported to child welfare authorities.
I'm now going to be talking about the barriers to resolving violence and abuse. The first one is the societal belief in the sanctity of the family. This means that the idea of what happens in the home stays in the home is reinforced. This belief stops victims of abuse from speaking out due to fear of consequences or fear of incriminating their family members. Another barrier is healthcare workers' inability to understand and intervene appropriately. We will discuss methods on how to prepare yourself as a future nurse in the next few slides. Finally, many victims hesitate to seek help because they don't feel safe to do so or are blamed for the abuse. There are two strategies for resolution I will be going over in the next few slides. The first is to educate all members of the healthcare team on matters concerning domestic violence. One such educational document was introduced by the RNAO in a best practice guideline entitled Women Abuse, Screening, Identification, and Initial Response. Through a series of recommendations, the primary goal of this document is to provide all members of the healthcare team a universal tool on how to routinely screen for women and girl abuse in all practice settings. In the traditional medical model, focus would be on the injuries sustained during abuse while ignoring other aspects. However, this framework incorporates a holistic view such that all aspects and consequences of women abuse are taken into consideration. In the context of nursing, this evidence-based practice guideline holds great significance because nurses are usually the first member of the healthcare team to interact with women. Nurses are also in a great position to screen for violence because they are accessible, trusted, and work in many practice settings that reach women in all stages of their development and illness. I'm going to briefly talk about the important recommendations made by the RNAO that directly impact nursing care. The first two recommendations state that nurses should implement routine universal screening for women in all healthcare settings, including girls over 12 years of age. Nurses should screen all women because symptoms of abuse aren't immediately apparent. Asking a few questions does not take a lot of time, can potentially change a person's life, and can help identify abuse early. Also, the Criminal Code of Canada says that girls between the ages of 12 and 16 are able to consent to sexual activity, so it's important to screen them as well. A few benefits of routine screening are avoiding stigmatization by asking all women about abuse, reducing the sense of isolation abused women experience, giving a strong message that abuse is wrong, fostering healthy communities, and illuminating many forms of abuse which women may not recognize. The third recommendation is nurses must develop skills to foster an environment that facilitates disclosure. This requires nurses to know how to ask the question and how to respond. As a nurse, it's up to you to create an environment that is open, safe, and non-judgmental. A way to achieve this is by having information about violence on display in the practice setting. An example of this would be to have posters in women's washroom where they can read it without being seen. The goal of screening is to facilitate disclosure. A way to start this off is by destigmatizing abuse by saying, I now ask all my clients about abuse because I find that abuse is so common in many people's lives. This normalizes the topic, making women feel safer to disclose abuse and sends a clear message that violence is not okay. Then, ask a question that is more specific. For example, you can say, sometimes people can say and do things to us that can be hurtful and make us feel confused and uncomfortable. Has anyone ever made you feel that way? Based on women's response, nurses can follow this decision tree. I'm not going to go through the entire chart, but the key point is to explore and assess women's responses as much as you can. It's also worth mentioning that at the end of the assessment, nurses may refer women to social workers where they can get additional support. The fourth recommendation is that nurses develop screening strategies and initial responses that respond to the needs of women, taking into account differences based on race, ethnicity, class, religious, spiritual beliefs, age, ability, or sexual orientation. Since our cultural backgrounds shape the way we view and respond to the world, some women may not recognize all forms of abuse, may think it is acceptable, or have differing perspectives on reporting of abuse. It's vital that nurses can educate all women from numerous backgrounds while taking into consideration general mistrust due to racism, sexism, and language or communication barriers. Also, nurses must realize that abuse occurs in homosexual relationships as well, so it is recommended to use gender-neutral language when screening for abuse. This is an example of an abuse screening tool. There are numerous screening tests depending on the institution. The fifth recommendation is that nurses must use reflective practices to examine how their beliefs, values, and experiences influence the practice of screening. And finally, recommendations number 6 and 7 state that nurses must know how to document when screening for and responding to abuse by following the professional standards for documentation outlined by the CNO. It's not mandatory for nurses to report abuse, since it's the woman's right to choose if she wants to involve police. Consent to report must always be given by the woman. On the other hand, teen abuse may be reported to the Children's Aid Society. Nurses also must know their legal obligation when a disclosure of abuse is made. Another strategy for resolution is to tackle the broader implications of abuse through political action. As nurses, it is our duty to advocate for our patients on all levels, including changing or implementing policies. One such organization, whose mission is to eliminate violence by advancing nursing practice, education, research, and public policy, is a nursing network on violence against women international. Their goal is to provide a nursing presence in the struggle to end women violence in order to enhance the quality and health of millions of women around the world. A key player in ending violence against women in Canada is Resolve. This organization's goal is to coordinate and support research aimed at ending violence against women and girls by creating strategies for resolution, communicating research findings to the public and policymakers, and to promote social change through education and awareness.
Let's have a look at what the CNO has to say about interpersonal violence. Violence between a nurse and a client in either direction opposes the development and maintenance of a therapeutic relationship. According to page 11 from the CNO professional standards, the client's needs are the focus of the relationship, which is based on trust, respect, intimacy, and the appropriate use of power. So, interpersonal violence in the context of a therapeutic relationship supersedes the possibility of trust, respect, and intimacy. The practice standards for a therapeutic nurse-client relationship, the nurse holds more power. That means the nurse has the onus of refraining from using this imbalance of power to engage in or incite physical, emotional, and sexual harm, as well as physical neglect. Therefore, the nurse is responsible for recognizing the potential for client abuse, preventing abuse when possible, and taking action to stop abuse and reporting it appropriately. Furthermore, nurses in an administrative role are responsible for fostering an environment in which clients and nurses are safe from abuse. Finally, we'll consider the CNO standards of confidentiality and privacy. Looking at disclosure without consent, nurses adhere to legislation that requires them to reveal confidential information to others. For example, the Child and Family Services Act of 1990 requires all healthcare professionals to report suspected child abuse to the Children's Aid Society. The Health Protection and Promotion Act permits reporting of certain conditions to the Medical Officer of Health.
So to bring all this knowledge closer to home, let's talk about a case study for our consideration. So you are a nurse working in the emergency room of a hospital in Kingston, Ontario. A pregnant woman aged 25 years old arrives at the ER concerned about abdominal pain. She is accompanied by a man who appears to be in his 20s. She has multiple bruises to her face. The man also has bruises and scratches to his face and has bruises and cuts on the knuckles of his hands. You introduce yourself as a nurse and ask the woman if anything happened before the abdominal pain. She says her name is Rose and that she fell down the icy steps of her home last night after she came home. She's looking at the floor while she says this. When you ask her if this has happened before, she looks at you directly in the eye and in an angry tone states, "Do I look like a klutz? No, I don't fall down the steps regularly if that's what you're asking." If it's okay, we just want to make sure that the baby is fine and that there isn't anything seriously wrong. The man speaks in a soft voice and glances away when you attempt to make eye contact with him. I told you we should have waited until the morning to see Dr. Rogers on the reserve. Anytime a Mohawk woman comes into the hospital, they think her man is hitting her. So now that we have presented some theoretical perspectives and some dialogue on how a nurse can address issues like this, how would you proceed at this point? What type of screening questions might you ask? Are there any tools available to assess risks of abuse or violence? Also, as a nurse, what type of information should you know about the population you serve? How can you build a caring, healing relationship with culturally diverse clients in this situation? Where can you find out more about screening for violence and abuse? So this is a short mnemonic we can consider when we tackle issues like this, when the notion to proceed might not be so clear for us. So we start with attitude and approachability, belief, confidentiality, documentation, education, respect, and recognition overall. So this concludes our presentation. Hopefully we have learned something that has affected our perspective on violence, and thank you so much.